Now it's time for another Board Game Brawl preview with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com. Hey now, my name is Nick, this is Board Game Brawl, and today we're going to be taking a look at a game that is currently seeking funding on Kickstarter. You only have about a week left at the time that I'm producing this video. That game is called Winds of Fortune, and it's from Safe Haven Games. Now, if you like what you see throughout the rest of this video, I'm going to have a link to the official Kickstarter page down at the bottom of your screen now, in the description section of the video, and also at the end of the video. That'll take you to the page. You can find out more information than I could possibly give you here, and hopefully you'll consider backing the project. Now, what is Winds of Fortune? It is a competitive game for 2 players. Each player takes control of a fleet of battleships in card format that they're going to be moving around strategically in order to destroy their opponent's flagship. Now, the theme, world, and setting of Winds of Fortune is interesting. It takes place after a cataclysm covered most of the world in water, sunk a bunch of the continents, and awoke a bunch of giant sea monsters from the deep to basically terrorize everyone, unless you're a part of a faction that can actually control these monsters. So in this base game, you take control of one of 2 different factions with either pre-constructed decks or decks that you flesh out with cards of your making. There's a bit of pre-deck building involved in the game if you want it to be that complicated. So you have the Holy Craftsmen who have these, as the name implies, they're sort of religious zealots who have access to very technologically advanced ships, but also some monsters as well, like dragons. And then you have the Cult of the New Reef, which has access to a lot of different sea monsters, also, as you might imagine from a name like that, and they are warring with each other, trying to destroy each other's flagships. It's obviously a little bit more complicated than that, but let me go ahead and give you a brief overview of what the game plays like with a prototype version of the game. So nothing you see here is final, nothing about the artwork and everything may change in the final version, so just keep that in mind. But then we're going to come back, I'll give you my final thoughts. Alright, I'm going to give you a very brief run through of Winds of Fortune. This is a competitive game for 2 players. You are either going to take control of the Holy Craftsman, and you'll have your own deck that you're going to choose at the beginning of the game, or you are going to be the Cult of the Reef. And I should also mention that while the game comes with pre-constructed decks, you can actually do some deck building with booster cards that come with the game. They're just extra cards that you can put in. You just have to follow the typical deck building rules. You can only have up to two of any particular card in your deck. Now, the goal of the game is to destroy your opponent's flagship. You are going to have a fleet of ships that you're going to be moving about down these up and down these firing lanes to destroy your opponent's ships, but you also have a flagship that is made up of 3 parts. Using the pre-constructed decks, you'll have it set here, but again, with deck building, you can actually construct the different parts of your ship however you like. So if we focus in a bit on the flagship here for this faction, you see that each of them has a hit point mark there, telling you how many points of damage that particular section of the ship can take. Your goal is to destroy each section of your opponent's ship. Every time that you destroy a particular section, you're going to flip that section face down. If all 3 sections are destroyed, you win the game, or you lose the game. And even if all 3 of your sections aren't destroyed yet, it still puts you at a disadvantage to lose 1 or 2 sections, because each one gives you a different special ability. So, for instance, this part of the ship for the Holy Craftsman, the Chum Siphons, which just sounds funny to say, gives +1 strength to all friendly monsters in this firing lane. Whereas on the bow part of the flagship, you have the Terrifying Figurehead, which says that once per turn, you may pay 1 doubloon in order to place a demoralized token on any enemy ship in play. So you can see it's very important to keep the parts of your flagship around as much as possible. Now, for the rest of the setup of the game, first off, you notice that there's 2 different boards, or there's 2 boards that each player is going to have, and you're going to line up the firing lanes on each player's board, so just like so. So that when players are putting their ships into each of the firing lanes, they'll have direct targets to the other players' lanes. You'll notice that they'll also mark short, medium, and long range. I'll get to that in more detail when we get into the gameplay aspects. Then you have spots for location cards, which you can also play. You have your treasury at the beginning of the game. If you are the first player, you only start with 2 doubloons, and you're going to put them into your spent doubloons pile, and your opponent is going to have 3 doubloons, which they'll put into their spent pile, but you're going to get those back into your treasury at the start, near the start of your turn. Then you have stocks over to the side which have damage markers, more doubloons, and moralize or demoralize tokens. And let me just show you some of the cards that each player is going to have in their deck. Now, these are Cult of the Reef cards, and you're going to have ship cards that you can play down into your lanes, like the Nautilus here. Up in the top corner for the ships, you're going to have the cost in doubloons to actually, let me focus in a bit there. The cost in doubloons actually put the card into play, and then there's a little tiny symbol here which actually tells you the vulnerability of this particular type of ship, so in this case, fire. Then off to the side, you're going to have its stats, so you'll have the strength, which is the star mark. Then you have its the heart here represents a hit points. It's the amount of damage that the ship can take before it is destroyed. Then its initiative, when this ship is actually going to get to fire relative to the other ships that are in its firing lane. You'll have the faction symbol down here at the bottom, so this says that this is a Cult of the Reef card. So it could be Cult of the Reef, it could be one of the other factions, or it could also be one of the neutral cards that you'll use for deck building purposes. And then, of course, there is the special ability. So the Nautilus here is a submersible, so instead of moving the ship, the controlling player may place a doubloon on it. While there's a doubloon on this card, it may not block, but may not take any damage either. It's also anti-air, so it actually gets extra strength against cards with aerial strike. Then you have like the Goblin Shark, and this is all the theme of the Cult of the Reef, that they have like these monstrous ships. You see they just have different stats, strength, hit points, higher initiative. You have the Ghost Ship, which can go ethereal. This is one of the location cards, the Cult of the Reef Spawn Yard. Locations also have hit points as well and can be destroyed and costs to put out. All Cult of the Reef ships cost one less to play while this card is in play. So this is kind of like a global enchantment type thing. The Cults of the Reef, actually both decks also have monsters that they can utilize, although the Cult of the Reef seems to specialize in them, so they have monsters like the Air Elemental, the Killer Crustration. Notice that they all have their own special abilities like throwing and smashing. The Horror from Beyond, which their special ability is maneuverable. This card may move diagonally, so which can be very powerful and useful. You also have upgrade cards in this game, like Chimeric Fusion, where you can actually treat one monster as an upgrade for another monster, or characters that you can use, like Defensive Strategist, which is a ship upgrade and is considered a crew, which says that when you withdraw, with the withdrawal ability, when this card would be destroyed, you return it to its owner's hand rather than discarding it. Then you have Commissaire Rain, another member of the crew. Lets you place 3 Inspire tokens on the ship that you use them as an upgrade for. And then just to show you some of the cards in the Holy Craftsman deck, of course, you have ships with a religious bent to them, like the Zealot, which says sacrificial. Rather than making a normal attack when at short range, the ship may be discarded to immediately discard one enemy in play. The Seraphim, which is like a very elaborate ship. The Inquisitor, which has flaming attacks, which gets +2 strength against all cards with a flame vulnerability. The Crusader, Castle Verda, which is one of the locations. You immediately draw a card at the start of every turn while this card is in play, and it has 8 hit points. The Holy Craft Yard, which says that all Holy Craftsman ships cost 1 less to play, kind of like the Cult of the Reef location card that I showed you. It has its own creatures in this deck, like the Dragon and the Sea Serpent. That's just a taste of some of the cards you'll find in this game. So the easiest way to describe how the game works is just to take you through the turn order. So I already told you that most of the setup here is done. Each player is going to have either 2 or 3 doubloons, depending on who you determine is going to be the starting player. Each player is also going to draw a hand of 5 cards, and you may mulligan once if you want, and reshuffle and redraw 5 cards. Then you're going to go into turn order, and then you start off with the preparation phase. In the preparation phase, you have a choice to make. You can either take 1 doubloon from the stash and place it into your treasury, or you can draw 1 card from your deck to add to your existing hand of cards. Also, it should be noted that at any point during your turn, including right now during the beginning phase, the preparation phase, you can spend 3 doubloons that you have available to you in your treasury in order to draw an additional card from your deck. Next, you have the refresh phase. And in the refresh phase, you're going to move over any spent doubloons that are in the spent doubloons section of your board back into your treasury, and now they are immediately available for the rest of your turn and possibly into the next turn as well. Also, at this point, you get to remove 1 demoralized token and 1 inspiration token from ships or areas that are underneath your control. I actually called this a moralized token before. I meant to say it's an inspire token, so it's either inspire or demoralize. Next, you go into the deployment phase. This is where you can actually play the cards from your hand, assuming that you have enough doubloons in order to cover it. So, very simply, let's say that I wanted to play a card that costs 3 doubloons. I can move those 3 into my spent doubloons section of my board, and I can play a card that only costs 3. So I can play the Cult of the Reef Spawn Yard, and I always play it into the location section of my board. Now, where you place the location can be important because you can actually... some ships can, or when ships do their movement, they can actually move onto a location card that is allowed. If I play a ship or a monster, they are going to go onto the long-range field of my firing lanes. Just kind of pretend that I'm going through multiple turns and I have enough doubloons to cast all these cards. The next type of cards you can play are upgrade cards, and if you play upgrade cards, those are actually going to upgrade ships and perhaps monsters that you have out on the board, but it has to specifically say which kind of creature it's going to upgrade. So this is a defensive strategist, so that can only upgrade a ship, but I do have a monster upgrade, so if I had enough doubloons, I could even play one of those as well, and I'll slide that underneath, showing that I have the upgrade on those applicable ships and creatures. Alright, next comes the action phase, and as the name implies, this is where most of the action is going to happen. When it's your turn, and it's your turn to do the action phase, you activate the ships that are on your side of the board. Next comes the action phase, and this is where all of the battles are going to take place. When it is your turn, you're going to follow these steps. First thing you do is you activate your ships. You activate ships one at a time and resolve them completely. Now, when you decide to activate a ship, you don't have to do this, by the way. It's purely optional, but... first thing you'll do is you'll declare a target, and so in order to declare a target, a couple of things have to happen. First off, the target has to be in your firing lane. So over here I've got a couple of ships and monsters for the Holy Craftsman, and they have to be in the fire. Let's say that I'm activating the Horror from Beyond, and I want to attack the Sea Serpent. So long as we're in the same firing lane, he's an applicable target, but also you have to make sure you're at the right range. Now, unless it says otherwise, every card is medium range, which means that your card has to be in either medium or short range in order to effectively make an attack. So let's say that on a previous turn, I had already moved my Horror from Beyond to this spot, so now I can make an attack against the Sea Serpent. Now, my opponent, the blocker, has 2 different choices that they can make. They can either decide to block with one of their units that is in that firing lane, and for the blocker, it doesn't matter where they are. Either way, they can decide to block. Or if they decide not to block with that ship or creature or monster, or if they have no defense there, then that attack is going to go against their section of their flagship that is in that firing lane. Now, if my attack goes straight through to that section of the flagship, then very simply I'm going to look at the strength of the card that I'm attacking with, and that damage is going to be applied directly to the part of the flagship. I'm going to put those damage markers onto the ship. But if one of the creatures does decide to block, which we'll say in this example is going to be the case, well, then you have to compare the 2 units' strength. And for right now, I'm just going to ignore potential special abilities. So, for instance, the Horror from Beyond has a strength of 4, and the Sea Serpent actually has a strength of 5. But what's most important right off the bat, aside from strength, is initiative. And this is where the other number is going to come in. You're going to compare the initiatives of the 2 creatures. Whoever has the faster, the higher initiative is going to get to do their damage first. So in this case, the Sea Serpent gets to deal its 5 damage to the Horror from Beyond first because it has an initiative of 4. And because the Horror from Beyond only has 3 hit points, can only take 3 damage, it is immediately going to die. Again, we're kind of ignoring special abilities and upgrades here just for this example. But if the situation had been reversed, or I should say if the Horror from Beyond was at least able to survive that attack, then it would get to deal its damage to the blocker or the attacker, whichever situation you're in. If the 2 initiatives are the same, by the way, you deal the damage simultaneously, which could result in both monsters or ships dying. Regardless, if there was a blocker protecting that section of the flagship, even if the blocking ship or monster was destroyed, no damage gets through to the flagship, barring any kind of special abilities. Also, any ship that either attacked or blocked gets depleted, meaning that while it may, if it survived, it's depleted, meaning that it cannot attack or block until it is refreshed on the next turn. Finally, any units who survived any kind of battle now have a chance to move. And remember, you can skip any steps, so you don't have to attack. You can go straight to movement if you really want to. Moves are normally orthogonal. Remember that the Horror from Beyond is a unit that can move diagonally, but for the most part, you have to move orthogonally, left, right, left or right, up or down, or potentially onto locations as well. Now, an important note about the locations, they do have hit points. They can be destroyed by enemy ships if those enemy ships and monsters, if they get within range. And one of the reasons why you might want to move one of your ships onto a location is in order to block that location from enemy attacks. Once you've had a chance to activate all of your ships, you are now going to pass turn to your opponent. Your opponent is going to do all of the same things, and then back and forth, going through preparation, refresh, deploying your cards out onto the battlefield, and then activating all of the applicable cards in order to try to destroy your opponent's flagship. That is essentially Winds of Fortune. That's a quick run through. Now, let's get to my final thoughts. There are a lot of things about Winds of Fortune that could potentially draw people in. First and foremost, you got to start off with that theme, which is very interesting because I think that there are a lot of pirate games popping up lately in the last couple of years, but this puts a completely different spin on it. There's also a lot of games that use the sort of Elder Gods, Ancient Ones, a Cthulhu theme. This one mixes just a dash of that in there with the great deep ones and the sea monsters that have arisen in the wake of this cataclysm. So you mix just a dash of that in. It doesn't overwhelm the theme of the game, together with the interesting Holy Craftsman faction, which is like religious zealots, and you're in this almost fantasy post-apocalyptic setting, pirate post-apocalyptic setting. So it's definitely something interesting and unique that I really haven't seen quite that mixture of themes together in another game, at least in any recent memory that I have. And then you combine that with the actual gameplay, which, originally when I first saw the game, my first thought was it was almost like Summoner Wars in a sense, because in the game Summoner Wars, which is a very popular game, you're moving cards around representing your units on like a strategic grid, so it's almost like a miniatures game using cards, and there is a bit of that here, the same basic premise here in Winds of Fortune, but again, just like with the theme, it takes that kernel there and spins it out into something brand new and unique, which again I haven't quite seen, where you have these different lanes representing range and being able to fire down those lanes, which, by the way, takes out a lot of the really complicated logistics that so many different games of this ilk, like miniature style games, have as far as determining range. Do I hit? Is it possible for me to hit you from where I am now? This simplifies it while at the same time retaining strategy. And a lot of that strategy comes from building your deck ahead of time if you want to do so. But the deck building isn't that complicated. You have everything you need in the base box to do some deck building. And of course, there will be further expansions to come, I'm sure. And, 2 cards of every, you can have up to 2 cards of a certain type in your deck. You can cater the deck to how you want, a certain amount of ships and locations. All of these different things give you a strategic bent, but also a flavorful bent. However you want to build your deck, the types of characters and upgrades that you want, you can do that. And then when you combine that with the mechanisms, it's it's very simple to keep track of your resources. In some games like this, you have magic or mana or whatever it might be. Now it's just doubloons, which makes sense. You're buying ships and you're buying the service of these monsters and things like that, and upgrades and crew members. And how it works is very simple. You have access to a certain amount of doubloons. You can gain more over time, either drawing cards or getting doubloons every round, and some special abilities will let you get those. And then they transfer either from your used to your not used pile. And you just get stronger and stronger and stronger over time. So again, I think the whole purpose of the game is that you have this interesting theme, and it gives you this taste of grander miniature scale combat, but it keeps the rules simple, direct, straightforward, while still retaining the strategy of the game. The whole aspect of trying to take out your opponent's flagship and having each piece of the flagship doing something different as well. And even if your opponent takes out 1 or 2 pieces of your flagship, you're still alive. You can still hang in there and possibly do something to come back. So every game is a nail biter. Now, if any of this sounds like it's going to be an interest to you, meaning that you like pirate themes, you like fantasy themes, you like strategic miniatures games, but you don't want to deal with the hassle of assembling and painting and dealing with a bunch of esoteric rules, this might be right up your alley, or whatever the ship equivalent of an alley is. And if so, if I'm correct in that, I urge you to go to the official Kickstarter project page. You can follow the link at the bottom of your screen now and down in the description section of the video, or go all the way back to the beginning of the video and click on that link. Anyway, it's going to work, and that will take you to the official Kickstarter project page. You only have about a week left to pledge to the campaign. Find out more information, find out if it's right for you, and hopefully consider backing the project. That is Winds of Fortune from Safe Haven Games. Thank you so much for watching. Take care. Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.